I'm Matt Downing, and welcome to Diving Deep EDU. Before we get rolling, I wanted you to hear about another great podcast.
Hey everyone, my name is Mike Dunn, and I'm one of the co-hosts of Rethinking EDU. Our podcast is a roundtable discussion about education possibility. We talk with professionals from around the country who are doing groundbreaking work reimagining and remaking schools. Come check us out at rethinkingedu.co or wherever you get your podcasts.
Now let's get started.
Curious conversations with all types of peeps. Encouraging innovation, we are diving deep. Certainly education is what we like to speak. Fervent with dedication, now it is time to teach. Yeah.
Hey everyone, and thanks for joining me on Diving Deep EDU. This podcast is based in conversations that are willing to go off on a rabbit trail or two in order to find those aha moments. Those times when someone is able to say something in a way that brings increased clarity. Now, I'm an educator, so much of our conversations will have that as the end goal. How can the things that we are talking about help us to dive deeper into educational practices? Thanks for tuning in. Our guest today is Amelia Nierenberg. Amelia is a writer for the New York Times focusing on the coronavirus schools briefing. She has also written about food at the Times, worked for the Associated Press in West Africa, and started things off at the Boston Globe. Amelia, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me on this wonderful podcast. It's really nice to meet you.
Thanks for coming. So you lived in Senegal and worked for the Associated Press. Senegal isn't a place that many people have visited, like myself. What was it like to live and work there?
Wow. I mean, how long do you have? The short answer is that it is probably the most important thing that's ever happened to me. It was my longer answer as follows.
Yeah.
It was my first job after college, and I knew I wanted to be a reporter, and I knew that I ultimately wanted to be a foreign correspondent one day, which is a dream that still holds true. And I applied for this fellowship on a whim, and then got the fellowship probably because they made a mistake. It's called the Overseas Press Club Fellowship, and they fund young journalists who want to be foreign correspondents and have language skills to go to countries. And so my mom actually flew with me because I was so nervous. And I spent my first week in Senegal with my mom, finding a place to live. We went to a lot of apartments in Dakar, and then I was off to the races. And it is perhaps the most exciting place I've ever lived. And I'm a born and raised New Yorker. And I reported every day in the tallest building in Dakar is, I think, one of the only buildings that's over 12 stories. And so you just say the name of the building. So all the taxis made it really easy, very easy to navigate. Just take me to the tallest building in the city. And it was just incredible to find the ways that the world opens up when you're new somewhere and people are friendly. And I only lived there for 6 months, but many of my closest friends are Senegalese, are married to people who are Senegalese, are people I met in Senegal, and I dream about it at night more than I care to admit. So it was a delight.
And obviously, this could be a long conversation. We could have the whole podcast on your experience there. And you also mentioned that it was exciting. Could you be able to bring us into a moment or an experience that sort of encapsulates some of that excitement that you felt while living there?
For sure. I mean, from a reporting perspective, West Africa, the Dakar Bureau covers all of West and much of Central Africa. So we were covering
Oh,
22
wow.
countries. As a baby reporter, went to the Gambia, which is in kind of a country that's bordered by Senegal. So I didn't do any of the big war reporting that my bosses were doing. But it is one of the fastest growing economies from an entrepreneurial perspective. It is one of the places most hit by climate change. There is a vast amount of social revolution happening in West Africa, continuing anti-colonial battles, a lot of gender revolution. Dakar as a city is an arts hub of the world. And I knew that going in. And then when I lived there, I mean, everyone I knew was an artist. My best friends were musicians, and I had, yoga teachers, and it was just this like explosion of creativity. So it's a place that feels, it's a time in the world history when a lot is happening in a very big place, and it was very obvious that my friends who were Senegalese knew that they were very lucky to be living at this time, and that their parents didn't have as many opportunities as they had. And my friends who weren't Senegalese, who had come there, knew how lucky they were to be in Senegal, which is a country in the region that has more opportunity than others, but not universally. So just kind of this, there was this feeling of vitality through all the storylines, and then life in Dakar was just, I mean, it was just wonderful. I lived 10 minutes from the beach, and my friends were like the coolest band in our neighborhood, and they were like local celebrities, and whenever we went to the beach, they'd bring their guitar, and all my friends were surfing, and I still kind of can't believe that I left. Um,
Mm,
but it was one memory that I love and
yeah.
miss is that I grew up Jewish. I'm very secularly, but we always tried to do Shabbat dinner, and I was worried about that. I really missed kind of the idea of a community meal and a communal meal. And then every weekend, Saturday afternoons were at my friend Big's mom's house, where like 35 people would come, and she'd make huge amounts of food, and everyone would just stay and pass the day. And then Sunday evenings, we would usually fish or eat fresh fish on the beach that my friends had either caught or their friends had caught. And it was another just 15, 20 people around one big fish and one big pot of rice. And
Mm,
um, it was a place where I learned a lot about community and family,
yeah.
that I hadn't learned before.
Yeah, it sounds magical. Tell me about one of the concerts that your friends, they're playing either on the beach or on sort of maybe a stage that they're sort of constructing. What was that like?
Oh, it was so fun. Big is the band leader, and he does Afrofuturist movement, and so it was like it was a lot of folk and guitar, but a lot of Senegalese instruments whose names I knew when I lived there, but I don't remember, and kind of synthesizers. And there are a ton of clubs in Dakar, so they would go and they'd play a set at a club. I always left early at like 4 a.m., and everyone else was
Okay,
still
that's early. Okay.
jamming away. But it was everything from a backyard concert to
Hmm.
a local bar to a very swanky club to jazz concerts. I mean, it was music. It's a city that is full of music. The only city I've ever been that feels like that, also is Galway in Ireland, where just every place
Hmm.
you walk by has music spilling out of it. And so Dakar is a city that is just resonant with sound.
And you wrote a lot of stories while you were there, or you were a part of, many stories that were written. Is there a story that you wrote, or you were a part of, or collaborated with that has stuck with you since that point?
Many, but one I did actually not for the Associated Press, but toward the very end of my stay, I went with my friend Stefano, who's a photographer, to the Gambia, and it's the country that I spoke about that was bordered by Senegal.
Yeah.
And the Gambia had a brutal brutal dictatorial regime for a long time, for like 20 years. And when I was there, it was like year 1.75 after the fall of the dictator. And there was this huge, I mean, if I had thought Senegal was a moment of just everyone feeling like something could happen, the Gambia was in total like excitement, and there was suddenly opportunity and people could express their opinions. And there were so many new newspapers cropping up, because the press had been many times Gambian journalists moved to Senegal to continue reporting on things that were happening in the Gambia, um, from outside, but lots of journalists were killed or tortured or silenced. And there was a new journalism school where these people who were my age, younger and older, who were early 20s, teenagers, knew they wanted to be journalists. They'd had family who had been suffered the effects of the regime, and they were the first class of graduates from this new journalism school. And just I mean, most people become journalists for kind of the same reason. They believe that information creates justice in society. Journalists are pretty curious. Journalists are very rarely rude, because you kind of can't be to have a good interview. But just the lived articulation of the power of the press is something that I had read about historically, but hadn't really encountered, even watching my colleagues in America over these past 4 years.
Yeah.
And just the passion and the fervor and the values first reporting that my friend, the people I met and who have since become my friends, worked with was something I think about a lot. And I wish that I had that energy in my reporting. I try to have a lot of energy, but just the sense of like my country will fall if I don't do this well is not something that I have ever really, really felt in the way that they have.
Yeah, and you had a foundation in, I assume, speaking French. And were you interacting with people in French, and were you also writing? How did you navigate with the language?
My high school had a very good French program, which was great, and so I spoke French. I took French in high school, and through college, and did a lot of my research for my master's thesis I did in French, and I wrote it in English, but was reading archives in French, so I was comfortable with the language academically. But it's very different French in Senegal than it is in Paris and Belgium, which is what I was used to speaking, and it was really hard. I mean, oh God, the amount of times that I said something. I was trying. One of my friends had cut himself. This was really early on. He'd cut himself on something, and we needed something. The pharmacies are like a completely different patchwork system, but we needed to get something to stop the blood. And the word for blood in French is sang, and the word for monkey in French is singe. And I ran into the pharmacy and was like, "We have to stop my friend's monkey." Who is this girl? I'm like, out of control monkey is actually like a pretty big problem, because that's dangerous. So so that was like every single day of life there, but mostly it was great.
Now, do you miss not speaking in French as much?
I do. Yeah, I do. It's I'm not nearly fluent enough for this to be true, but my friends who are truly bilingual will say that they are different people in different languages that they speak. There are parts of my personality. I don't know if it's because I was speaking French or because I was in Senegal, which is a very different country, but I miss, I was much chiller when I spoke French than I am now. And it's just, I mean, it sounds prettier than almost any language in the world. So I miss hearing people just make beautiful sounds every day.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember your dreams when you wake up or not, but do you remember dreaming in a different language, whether it be, the traditional French or the French that they spoke in Senegal?
It's a really good question. I will try and pay attention, but my dreams are much more like colors and
Mm,
textures, and I don't know how much dialogue I can remember. More kind of like feelings and
yeah.
scenes.
Yeah, I'm always jealous of people that can like wake up and they can recall a dream with like specificity, and I'm just like, I'm not sure what was really going on,
Yeah.
in my dream. Then from Senegal, you moved back to New York City and working with the Times, where you started with a focus on food. Now,
Mhm.
as you got into that and you started working, on food, writing about food, what was your angle as you interacted with food in New York City?
So the the answer that I'm sure my editors would not want me to say but is the true one, is that I actually don't know that much about food. Most of the people on the food desk have gone to culinary school or
Mhm.
worked in restaurants or really, are people who love food. And I've never been to culinary school. I've never worked in a restaurant. Like, I'm not even that, honestly, that good of a cook. I improved, but I'm still not like a great cook. And so I didn't have I would not be good at going to a restaurant and like writing beautifully about the different things because often I still don't know ingredients on a menu or just, this tastes delicious. I have no idea if it's better than all the other, lamb shanks in the world. So the like tactileness of food, which so many of my
Mm,
colleagues are so good at understanding and writing about, is just, you know, I'm not the person to do that. So I sort of approached food kind of as a lens, which sounds cliche, but that's the best word I know to describe it, and thought about food more as okay, like which is not new to me. Most food writers do this, but they could also write a recipe to go along with it. But like so these people are selling these really good arepas. Who are they?
mm,
What does it mean for them to be? Is this a business that they're doing because they have to or because they want to? Or you know, there's a drought in New Mexico. What does that mean for the prize state vegetable, the hatch chili pepper? Well, like let's go to New Mexico and find out. So it was kind of a like okay, food is immigration, food is culture, food is small business, food is agriculture, food is climate change, and food is all the delicious stuff that other people can do better than me. So, um, if I want to tell a climate change story, what's a good food to tell it? And how do you go from there?
yeah, well, let's delve into that New Mexico hatch chili pepper because you wrote a piece on that.
Good, yeah.
What did you uncover in that piece?
So one of the things that I will say generally about the Times is that a lot of the Times breaks news, and a lot of the times the Times takes a national angle to something that everyone who lives there already knows. Um,
Mm,
the New Mexico story was, I think, the latter. Like, if most people, many of my closest friends are from New Mexico just by happenstance, and it wasn't news to them that the hatch chili is delicious and that
mhm,
it's like, and that climate change is bad and like aridification is happening.
yeah,
But it was, I think, I hope, a pretty useful story for people who maybe liked New Mexican food or, had been there or were worried about climate change and food systems in general to anchor it
mm,
as like, here's a concrete thing that could be lost. Because the hatch chili, I mean, I hadn't known this really before knowing New Mexicans, but I don't, I mean, there isn't really a food that I can think of to a New Yorker that, and New York is a city of like bagels and pizza, and like people mess with the New Yorkers like bagel or pizza, but the hatch chili is different. It's like, it's a real state pride. And so for that to be lost, I mean, I guess it would be like, climate change killed the New York City dollar slice, but like the New York City dollar slice isn't that good. Like that's not like a delicious food thing. It's
mm,
just it's like a necessary part of the hustle, and that's why New Yorkers like it. And like there's a great equalizer to the dollar slice. But like the hatch chili is like a great interesting flavor. And climate change compromises that. So I think it just made it feel real. But I also think that a lot of New Mexicans probably rolled their eyes and said, like, thank you, New York Times. I knew that
Yeah.
already, which is a fair criticism.
Now, I don't know if you're sort of doing this on purpose to get us to read the article, but you're sort of leaving us on a cliffhanger here. What's going on with the Hatch chili pepper? And for the listeners, yeah, we got to go read, the entirety of it. But can you give us a little insight there?
Sure. Basically, incredible, yummy, smoky pepper. New Mexico, like much of the Southwest, has one of the main consequences of climate change in the Southwest is drought and drying out, and big problems of just like irrigation. And southern New Mexico also grows lots of other crops like potatoes. I think I did this reporting a while ago. Watermelons, pinto beans. You should fact check me before you do that, but you listeners. But big like industrial ag crops, and the Hatch chilies are great, but because they're spicy peppers, you don't actually need. You're not going to eat like 6 Hatch chilies in a day,
Mhm.
whereas you might eat 6 potatoes, and they're a niche artisanal thing, and growing ever more so. So not only is this thing kind of in jeopardy because it's also kind of a financial consideration for farmers where sure they could divert their water to grow these peppers which like do call for a fair bit of water, and they keep the energy of their district alive, and like this is something their families planted for 100 years.
Yep.
But they might be losing out on money that they could, or they're not irrigating a high cash crop, um, which with the state of farming in America and our like failure to bail out farmers and our failure to like create trade systems that make it possible for farmers to like actually profit, that's a really hard calculation to make, because if the question is like, oh, should we grow Hatch chili peppers this year? I don't know. It's a lot of work. It's a very different calculation than like that we haven't made a profit in 5 years, and that's money that we might not get back. So that's kind of the state of it. But you should just read my article.
Now, I have to ask, before we move on to talking about something else, I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, but what's a restaurant in New York City, maybe one off the beaten path that serves some of your favorite food that, you could share with our listeners and they can go there next time they're in New York City?
Ooh, I live right around the corner from Aldi La Trattoria in Park Slope, Brooklyn, and it's just like bang up good from Italy, Italian food, like perfectly chewy pasta, always has something interesting. So that's
Okay.
a really good one.
Okay, can you repeat that one more time and the location? Like not the exact location, but the neighborhood again?
It's Aldi La. It's Aldila Trattoria in Park Slope, Brooklyn. It's on Fifth Ave and I think Carroll Street. Really good.
Okay.
I wrote about this place, La Morada, in the Bronx, and it's like made from scratch. It's Mexican food, indigenous Mexican food, and the family that owns it many of them are undocumented, and they're very high profile leaders in the South Bronx's fight for the rights of undocumented people, and especially the rights of undocumented restaurant workers. And their son, who my friend Marco, is like really visibly on the front lines in his own struggle to get documentation and I think political asylum. I could be wrong. Got a lot of press interest. So not only going there will you have like amazing mole that has been, and pozole, like that has been cooked for hours and hours and hours with like perfect technique, but you'll also go and you'll be supporting a business that is a center of community activism. They have this bookshelf at the back that has like, everyone from like Noam Chomsky to Gabriel Garcia Marquez to just like great thinkers of the 20th century, which I think is like, a lending library. So really cool place. And that's La Morada. in the Bronx. And then,
Oh, wow. You're going to give us a third?
no, I'll stop. It's okay.
No, please.
Tiny plug, we're talking about Senegal. Teranga in South Harlem is just really amazing, and it makes me it's like eating in Dakar. And the chef Pierre Thiam is just remarkable. So
That's
those
great.
will be
And
I was
and you hit up different neighborhoods with
I had
and
I mean I had
different
to
communities. Yeah.
serve your listeners.
And now I have a couple places to hit up next time we're there. So thank you. And thank you also for sharing that story behind that restaurant in the Bronx, that sort of brings to light, many things that I don't understand when I go into a restaurant or may not understand when I go into a store. And now if I go into that restaurant, that store, my eyes will be open more to that. And I appreciate that.
It's a nice thing to say. Thank you.
Your most recent shift at the Times is with the coronavirus schools briefing. I'm pretty sure you didn't expect it to be lasting this long when you started the project. I know for me, I thought it was going to be lasting like maybe 3 weeks. And here we are. And little did I know. So there's a lot to unpack here. But in New York City, what do you think has worked surprisingly well as schools have attempted to operate in the midst of the coronavirus?
Ooh, so little good news this semester. So
Yeah.
that's a good question. This is a really cheesy first thing to say, so I apologize. But and there's a ton of politics, and there are a ton of people that are, whatever, being bad. But I think that one of the things that has struck me in pretty much every interview is that people actually really care about each other and are really worried about each other and are really worried about the kids. And just one of the things that I think has worked well, or the places that it has worked well, are places where people have, been able to say, okay, and why are we here? We're here to educate kids. And that's happening a lot more than we're reporting, than anyone's reporting. By and large, teachers and parents and students are showing up for each other and for education, even if they are squabbling. So I think that's one of the things that's working well. I think that from a policy perspective, we saw early on that schools with optional masks had outbreaks, and schools that had mandatory masks had fewer outbreaks. So mandatory masking, just statistically, reduces risk of viral spread. I mean, one of the things that's working well in general is schools. Science may change, but right now the forefront of my understanding and most people's understanding of epidemiology and public health is that there's lower transmission in schools than there is in general. So schools in general are doing well. Open windows and ventilation systems, schools that are really leaning in on that's doing well. So I think one of the things with a lot of the school stuff that from architects and folks I've spoken to is it's not actually that much new technology is required. You just have to have a district and have administrators and have the ability to fund, if you need to replace all your windows, you got to replace all your windows, and then you can get the kids back in classrooms. Or if you need to take over the gym and make it, that's that sort of stuff. You have to be, it will cost money, and not all districts or schools have that ability, but the districts that have allocated funds to making sure all the teachers get PPE, making sure there's a testing regimen in place, making sure that there's enough people to contact trace, making sure that pods are maintained really strictly and well. Those districts actually do pretty well. And there are lots and lots and lots of kids who have been in classrooms, with modifications, but relatively and uninterruptedly across the country. And I think that is a victory.
Yeah, I wanted to start off positive, but we have to. I want to get your insight on some of the failures. What just the tops. What have been some failures that have just sort of stuck out to you during this process?
I mean, again, cheesy. I think a failure is when people forget why they're there. I think that there are a lot of reasons. And this is very, very rarely. Again, the vast majority of teachers and parents or students are trying to educate kids. I think that some people are some individual teachers or individual schools or individual parents are not focusing on that goal. I think that in general, most people seem to be trying to communicate. I think there are times when we've reported on unions and districts that have been widely criticized for not communicating well, even if they're fighting. Chicago is, the teachers have very valid grievances. The district has very valid grievances. The kids have very valid, like everyone has a good points to make and a compromise, as all compromises falls in the middle. But myself, I haven't criticized, I guess I'm doing it now, but union leaders and other districts and national union leaders have all said, the communication has broken down between the union and the district. And, both the union and the district say the other side broke down communication. And that's probably true. But like, what is the like number one rule of teachers? It doesn't matter who starts it, it matters who stops it. And like there hasn't been enough movement in that direction. That's partially my opinion, which I'm not supposed to give, but that's mostly based on reporting, just from lots and lots and lots of much more influential people. I think that one of the failures we've seen from higher ed is just schools that again, testing really does work. Regular voluntary or regular mandatory free testing works, and schools that have once or twice weekly tests that all of their students who are on campus have to take and on or interacting with the campus community have to take, like those schools, even if they've had momentary surges, they've been mostly able to keep cases percentage positivity percent below 1%. Like that's a victory.
Yep.
And I think that one of the things that hasn't worked is districts that didn't prioritize making resources available for remote learning and that both means like they didn't realize they needed to make sure all the kids had both internet and a device. A couple of districts like sent out a bunch of computers and like the kids were like, great, do I sit in a Dunkin' Donuts parking lot with this thing? Like, well, we don't have Wi-Fi at my house. So that was a failure. And I think another failure from the teacher side is that a lot of teachers were like, now you're teaching remotely, good luck. And there wasn't enough resources for some districts and some schools to just be like, and this is how you work Zoom. And like, how are you feeling? How are you doing? How are you talking about this? And then I guess the final failure that is across the board is that this is like the worst semester ever, even if your school has had like no cases and everyone's been fine, because 300,000 Americans have died and lots of people have lost their jobs and like you can't hug your friends and like, everything sucks right now, even if some things suck a little bit less. And there just hasn't been a national conversation on the mental health toll that teachers have to deal with teachers are guidance counselors and like helping kids find food banks, and it's heroic and exhausting, and they're not getting like mental health resources enough at all, and the kids aren't either. The kids, as you make sure that there's a nurse in every school, which I think is a really good policy in general, and especially during a pandemic, a nurse is a front line of the physical health concerns of a kid. A nurse is not, usually, nor should they be trained as guidance counselor, like, everything like that. And people really need that. And we're not talking about like collective grieving enough. So that's a failure too. There are many. I could go on. I've been reporting on the failures since August. There's so many failures, but thematically, those are some.
And I really enjoy the coronavirus schools briefing. One of the things I really like about it is it has the New York City focus, but then you guys widen the lens. You look at different regions, and then you even look at other parts of the world. Like I think this week you had an article on what's going on in Germany, and that's really insightful. As you look at that, not talking about, what's been helpful or failure or positive or negative, but what have you seen as like differences, right? That just sort of like pop off the page. Oh, wow, that is a major difference between New York City and another part of another region, or New York City and another part of the world, or Do you get what I'm asking with that question?
I think so. I mean, every district, the New York, the United States does not have a unified policy. Many other countries do have a unified policy, which I guess is one of the differences. But there's no real national policy here.
Yeah.
So if there are I'm pulling this number out of nowhere, but I feel like there are 50,000 districts in the country. Let's say there are 50,000 for argument's sake. That's 50,000 different coronavirus schools like approaches, which is crazy. I mean, that's like a nutty way. That's bananas. So one of the major differences is that almost every other country that we have reported on has a national strategy. I think that the place that schools fall. Let me back up. Dr. Leanna Wen, who was, I think she was like the chief, the health commissioner of Baltimore. But she's someone that I've spoken to, and she's really someone, when you talk to someone and you're like, well, you're smarter than me and you're smarter than everyone else I know. She
Yeah, I feel that all the time.
yeah, me too. But she's chief among people I've spoken to where I was just like, and then what happened? But she has this idea of a coronavirus risk budget, which I think is really helpful. Which is basically like, let's say we all have X amount of risk. We all know we have to go to the grocery store. That let's say that uses 10 out of the 100 risk nuggets. We all have to go. We all have to exercise. If you wear a mask and you do it outside, that's 3 risk budgets. But schools are the amount of like budget that different countries allocate to opening schools is very different. And not across the board, but the United States seems to be one of the countries that is allocating the least amount of budget to opening schools. And a lot more of that is going to, businesses in the economy, such as restaurants and shops and nail salons and all sorts of things that keep the economy going, in part because the United States does not have a comprehensive stimulus plan in the way that most other countries do. So we just did this recent send on Germany, which even in their lockdown light, when I think there were curfews and some bars closed and stuff, like schools stayed open. In France, infection rates were like 11%. The national positivity rate in France was 11%. No one was eating at restaurants. Bakeries were closed. Like everything was closed, and kids were going to school. And that's because France has allocated more of its like coronavirus risk budget to in-person learning, which you can only do if you have a stimulus package, and you pay people to stay home because it's like unreasonable to ask people to just give up their jobs. So anyway, but I think that in general, that's one of the places that the U.S. really differs. One of the other places that the U.S. really differs is its internet resources and access. I just 5 minutes ago, I was talking about how kids don't have computers and Wi-Fi, but like the internet is something that is much more available and present and part of American life than it is in Kenya, which just stopped its school year, and all the kids are restarting the school year in January, to the last of my knowledge, because so many kids just don't, there's not enough internet in Kenya, and there are not enough computers in Kenya. So Kenyan school children could not learn remotely, so they just stopped school, which created its own problems. And our Nairobi bureau chief had a great article about it. So you should, if you're interested, Kenya schools NY Times, you'll find it. But we just reported on Germany. Germany is a country that leads the fight in data privacy. They're very concerned with their data privacy. My boyfriend is German. He has so many passwords. Like, Americans were not as concerned with data privacy. And so we are much more comfortable on Google Classroom because we're much more comfortable with Google Suite than your average German would be. So national differences shake out in general. But I think the coronavirus budget allocation and the ability to transition to remote learning are 2 of the biggest things that's different across countries.
As we're looking at education and the coronavirus and these past, however long this has been, is there anything that we can learn from this, or is it something that we just get out of and move on into a different situation? Or are there truths that can be learned as we move forward? What do you think?
What a good question. I'm still just like drumming my fingers for a vaccine. So that
Yeah.
is I like the hopeful, not 6 months but 5 years question.
Mm,
I think I did a story which was one of my favorite stories I've done on education about outdoor schools.
yeah.
And I think that the outdoor school movement is something that a lot of countries are more focused on than the United States, pandemic notwithstanding. Um, my best friend's little brother is Swedish, and they live in Sweden. And Kiki, her little brother, like didn't go inside until he was 10, and Kiki's the best. And so I think that a lot of other countries understand how school sorry, I just hiccuped. How school can be still learning focused and use the natural world, and have explored that more than the United States has. A lot of that's because the United States, has a very different relationship to public space and to nature, and in cities it's much harder. But the pandemic the potential for outdoor created a necessity for outdoor learning, and a lot of the schools that I interviewed and a lot of the people that I interviewed who were experimenting with it, like the universal message from the dozen and a half interviews I had was like, "We love this. This is the best. We should do this more. The kids love
Mhm.
it outside." And as the climate crisis becomes, ever more of a crisis, the more you can get kids looking at leaves, the more likely they are to, take science seriously. So there are a lot of win-win-wins on that. Um, I'm curious to see how a lot of the test optional and test blind stuff looks like this year with colleges saying we really actually don't care about your SAT and ACT
Mhm.
like scores. You really don't need to take them. Um, I'm curious to see if that sticks. I mean, that's a really interesting part of this whole conversation. A lot of people are still taking them anyway because they don't believe the colleges. The colleges keep saying, no, 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 we're really serious. And the SAT and the ACT have been, constantly reformed, and, the amount of studies about how the SAT correlates with income level, but not great, like success, but, everything about those tests is constantly under review and constantly under debate, and the optionalness of them. Um, I wonder what that will do to testing standards in general. Um, and then I think the coronavirus and the protests against police brutality this summer showed and exposed systems and systemic injustices in a way that I think people had spoken about, but it hadn't reached a broad American consciousness yet. I think when I was growing up, we definitely learned about racism, but racism was something that was like, don't be racist to another person rather than like racism, the structure. And I think that within schools, because like people of color are much more likely to die of the coronavirus because of racism, and the protests happened and curriculums have to change because of racism. I wonder if the approach to society as a series of systems, which the coronavirus has exposed and social movements have exposed, will continue throughout like curriculum considerations
Yeah.
after this.
For teachers or leaders or families listening, do you have a project idea that they could be doing now? Something was mentioned a couple weeks back in the coronavirus schools briefing, and I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I don't have kids yet, but hope to one day. So parents and teachers have there are infinite resources for anyone, looking for this type of stuff. We suggested something which the responses that we got to this were so cute and so cool. To have your kids do like a state of the block,
Mhm.
like a newsletter about the goings on of the house. And like 15 parents sent me what their kids had done, and they were so funny and cool. And someone interviewed their dogs and wrote like a story from the perspective of their dogs, this third grader, and interviewed their family members about their jobs, and like documented the way that a tree was changing colors and found all these fun facts. And like, we all get a lot of emails. I get a lot of emails. I read like every page of these because it was so fun. And the kids were like, it's a writing project and it's an observing project. It's a science project if you make it a science project. So a state of the block newspaper would be my recommendation, but there are so many other things to do, and you should totally look at like people who write about parenting if that's an actual thing. But it was really fun to read those, and if and when I'm a parent, I'm sure I'm going to make my kids do like annoying writing exercises like that. I'm a journalist, so. But
one thing I liked about it was there are a lot of things I liked about it, but one thing was the choice, giving students choice, and and I also liked how it was built to their community and their place. Like, it wasn't telling them to go somewhere else, but like right where you're at, interview your neighbor that you've maybe said hi to, but you've never asked them about their life. Take a picture of that interesting bush and write a story about it. I know my kids have this cat that goes up and down the block, and they've named it, and they've taken pictures, and they they have a story of the cat. And I don't think the story's true, but they've interviewed people on the block and have a story of the cat. But I think they're mixing cats together and creating this.
What's the story of the cat?
I don't know. They think the cat was, born from this house about five houses down. They had a cat, and the cat had babies, and one of the cats got out, the little baby cat, and this cat stayed close. Now, I don't think this is true, but this cat stayed close and is roaming up and down. And the cat's name is Molly, and the cat's like 10 years old. And the cat gets fed by the back door, a neighbor 3 houses down. They feed the cat every night.
I love your kids, but that's so cool. Like, they're creating, that's like a novel. Like, I totally read a children's book about like Molly the cat that like can't leave the block. She's like Molly from the block,
That's a great title. Amelia, this has been a wonderful conversation. I've loved it, loved every part of it. It's been really insightful. As we get to the end, who do you want to give a shout out to?
I would like to give a shout out to Alexander Russo, who is an education reporter. He, I think, founded or is the head of The Grade, which is like a publication and a newsletter. His Twitter feed is so helpful to me and so helpful to all people, all education reporters. He also does a really good job of being an education reporter that not only writes about like what's actually happening in schools, but also kind of nudges education reporters to do their jobs better. He'll often release like, here's how you can make sure that you're actually like representing the people that like where they are, and criticizes our stories in ways that sometimes I agree with, sometimes I really don't agree with, but are always really helpful, because we either get the like, we hate you, I'm never through the time, types of emails, or we get like, I just love the work you're doing. And, I love your work, the work you're doing, but that's rarely specific, and like fake news, like, isn't really specific either, but like he has these very measured, very helpful reflections. And he said a really nice thing about Adam Pasek and myself and wrote a lovely article about our newsletter. So big shout out to Alexander Russo. Keeps it honest.
Time for the final word. What would you like to say to close out this podcast?
2 words. 1, I've had so much fun and I'm so honored that you invited me. Thank you. And then 2, I just like, we talk about how teachers are heroes. We talk about how working parents are heroes. Like, kids are so cool. They're educating themselves. Like, this is so hard. And they're like, all the kids that I've interviewed are so cool, and they're trying so hard, and they really do care. And so I would add kids, as I know it's cheesy. I like cheesy. I really believe this. I think kids are also heroes in the education story of this semester and this year.
Great. Amelia, this has been a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on Diving Deep EDU. I appreciate your insight and sharing your unique perspective. To those listening, thank you. Thank you for tuning in to Diving Deep edu. If you like this episode, subscribe, share it out, post a review on Apple Podcasts. All those things will help get this podcast out to more people. Until next time.
Wow, it's time to reflect. That's astounding. You've been checking out the podcast from Matthew Downing. Hope you like diving deep like a scuba diver. And the show provoked hope. That's our true desire.